These are 5 unexpected draft winners in Edge of Eternities. These cards might not look like much when you first read them, but they are great and will help you win more games when you put them into your decks. First up is Melded Moxite. For 1 and a red, you get an artifact that says, when this artifact enters, you may discard a card. If you do, draw 2 cards. Then it has 3, sacrifice this artifact, create a tapped 2/2 colorless robot artifact creature token. Now this sort of card has been seen many times throughout Magic's history. Most recently in Ether Drift, there was Kickoff Celebrations, which is very similar with this kind of marginal effect of upside, and then the main effect being it comes into play, you discard a card and draw 2 cards. So usually really useful as a flood insurance type card, where if you're drawing too many lands, you can discard one of your extra lands to draw hopefully 2 more spells. Now the difference between Melded Moxite and previous iterations of this card is it has a real sizable impact on the board state because you can sacrifice it to create a actual creature that can attack your opponent. So if you top deck this in the late game, it's not only helping you get rid of a land, it's also providing you with an attacker that can pressure your opponent's life total in a top deck battle or block or any of those things. Also, this is a set where having random artifacts in play is useful for various sacrifice shenanigans or things like that, so Melded Moxite gets extra upside from that as well. And overall, this goes from the sort of effect that generally you'd be thinking, oh my gosh, 2 mana, discard a card, draw 2. That's a very borderline fringe playable, maybe my last playable in my deck that I'll put in. But in this set, it's actually a solid card that you're happy to put into your deck. Next is Gene Pollinator. For green mana, you get a 1/2 artifact creature that says, tap an untapped permanent you control, add 1 mana of any color. Now this sort of effect has been seen many times in Magic's history, but a lot of the times it doesn't say tap an untapped permanent you control, it says tap an untapped creature. And actually the most recent time we've seen a very similar effect like this is Citadel Stalwart. So there was a bit of a clue that this Gene Pollinator could be quite good because Citadel Stalwart was a very similar effect. It was actually just a strictly worse card. It wasn't an artifact, which is a relevant card type in this format. It also was a 1/1 instead of a 1/2, and it could only tap an untapped artifact or creature. So generally doing very similar things to Gene Pollinator, but Gene Pollinator is a better version of this card. And as time goes on, of course, you expect cards to get better because of the way Magic cards are designed. But Gene Pollinator being a better Citadel Stalwart should have been a bit of a heads up that this card would be a great performer, and it has been. This is a card that can help you fix your colors. It can help you ramp up because there are so many lander tokens running around. The card just does excellent things in the format. Gene Pollinator is definitely one that you're going to want to take a little bit higher than you might expect for this sort of card, and it's just going to be a nice piece in your decks. It even has synergy with some cards that care about being tapped. So overall, Gene Pollinator, a card you're going to be very happy playing and definitely an overperformer. Next is Focus Fire. For a single white mana, it's an instant that says Focus Fire deals X damage to target attacking or blocking creature, where X is 2 plus the number of creatures and or spacecraft you control. Now, throughout Magic's history, we've seen lots of white-based removal spells that have this deal damage to an attacker or blocker. We've seen things like 2 mana deal 3, 2 mana deal 4. We've seen 1 mana deal 2s. We've recently seen Steer Clear in Outlaws of Thunder Junction, which was a 1 mana deal 2, but if you met a certain criteria, it could be a 1 mana deal 4, and that card itself wasn't particularly great. Focus Fire, on the other hand, is X damage where X is 2 plus the number of creatures and or spacecrafts you control, and having the clause about having creatures in play, buffing the damage, makes this card so much better. You're oftentimes going to get 1 mana deal 4, which is a very efficient spell. Sometimes you're going to get even more than that, and you also can have it be to the point where it's not that easy for your opponent to interact with, where if you have a spacecraft or something like that, you can deal like 1 mana deal 3, and they'd have to kill your spacecraft in response in order for that to be 1 mana deal 2. So it's going to be hard for them to stop that from happening. So Focus Fire has been a very impressive card, a great premium white removal, whereas before this sort of effect has sometimes been more fringe because it's a little bit inefficient to spend 2 mana for to deal 4 or things like that. 1 mana to deal 4, sometimes even more damage, is really, really strong. It's not that hard to enable it, and Focus Fire is worth prioritizing. Next is Gravpack Monoist. For 2 and a black, you get a 2/1 flyer that says, when this creature dies, create a tapped 2/2 colorless robot artifact creature token. This card is very reminiscent of the similar card Doomed Dissenter, which is 1 and a black for a 1/1, and when it dies, you create the 2/2 black zombie creature token. This sort of card has been seen many times in black, but by adding the extra mana, making it a flyer, and giving it a little bit of extra power, Gravpack Monoist is actually a relatively unique type of card, which means it's interesting to evaluate. And the thing about Gravpack Monoist when compared to those previous cards is in the previous comparison, the thing like Doomed Dissenter is used as a sacrifice synergy piece. You have a random 1/1 that you're happy to sacrifice to your cards, and you can then sacrifice the 2/2 that you get from those, or you're just looking for a way to get the 1/1 and upgrade it into that 2/2. Graph-Pack Monoist is actually a better card as a 2/1 flyer on the front side of the card than it is as a 2/2 robot, and that was initially a little bit misleading when evaluating this card, because you don't really want your necessarily Graph-Pack Monoist to die because it's a flyer that's hitting your opponent for damage. But that's exactly where the card gets a lot of its strength, is because your opponent kind of has to deal with a 2/1 flyer that's chipping in for damage, or a 2/1 trades with a lot more creatures, whereas Doomed Dissenter type cards are chump blocking as 1/1s. A 2/1 can actually trade with things, and then you're left with an extra resource, and that means that this card is more often going to feel like a 2-for-1 than those other cards where you're going to have to do a little bit more work, use a sacrifice outlet, things like that to make them feel like a 2-for-1. So Graph-Pack Monoist has been a nice performer at 3 mana, and definitely a card you're going to be happy playing. Flying is pretty good in this format, and the 3-drop is just going to fill out your curve nicely, and also be a card that if you need to sacrifice something to an effect, you can sacrifice the Monoist, but you don't have to. You can just use it as a 2/1 flyer that's going to be a very sticky threat, hard for your opponent to get off the battlefield, because when it dies, you still have a creature in play. So that's a nice thing to be aware of. Now, the final card we're talking about is Cellcraft Mechan. For 3 into blue, you get a 3/4 artifact creature that says, when this creature enters, you may sacrifice an artifact. When you do, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature and draw a card. So if you're targeting itself, you're basically getting a 4 mana 4/5 that drew you a card when it came into play, and the cost was sacrificing an artifact. Now, that is going to be a card that's very format dependent. If there's no other artifacts in the format, then the card would obviously not be very good, because you just have a 4 mana 3/4. But in a format with lots of artifacts like Edge of Eternities, this card does a lot of work. There's some really powerful synergies at common. There's Cryogen Relic. There are lander tokens to sacrifice. There's plenty of artifacts that you don't mind sacrificing. Nutrient Block is another one that comes to mind. And Cellcraft Mechan, again, I like doing these comparisons because it's a good way to kind of see where the sorts of initial evaluations come from on these cards. It's kind of reminiscent of a Benthic Criminologists type card from Murders at Karlov Manor, so which was a 5 mana 4/5 that when it entered or attacked, you could sacrifice an artifact to draw a card. And if you're doing that enters the battlefield sacrifice effect, then Cellcraft Mechan is just like a full mana cheaper to get a very similar card. So Benthic Criminologist would come in as a 5 mana 4/5 that could sack an artifact to draw a card. Cellcraft Mechan can come in as a 4 mana 4/5 that sacrifice an artifact to draw a card. Now, it doesn't have the attack clause, but you can see that initial impact is much bigger and for a whole mana less. And that could have been a nice little clue that Cellcraft Mechan could be a nice tool. Now, Benthic Criminologist wasn't a great card, but Cellcraft Mechan is actually quite powerful. It plays super well in what blue's trying to do. Definitely not a card you should be sleeping on. It's got a ton of value built into it. In a pinch, you can even sacrifice it to itself if you just really need to try and like top deck a removal spell or something like that. But generally, this is going to be a card you're happy to play, has great synergy with other blue cards, and is quite powerful. So definitely one you'll be wanting to take. That's going to do it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching. If you made it to the end, leave hashtag Super5 in the comments section down below. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll talk to you next time.